Space has always been my home. Well, as much as the endless void can be home to any human being. 15 years of training, 3 ISS rotations, and the first lunar return mission under my belt. I thought I knew everything there was to know about spaceflight. But sitting here now, watching my crew slowly lose their grip on reality, I realize how naive I was. How naive we all were. My name is Michael Cooper, and I'm recording this because someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand what's really out there, waiting in the darkness between stars. It started 3 days before our scheduled launch. Our mission was classified from the beginning. Deep space observation, they said. Simple enough. We'd trained for 2 years with state-of-the-art equipment, running countless simulations and emergency protocols. Our crew was the best NASA had to offer. Commander Maria Rodriguez, 20 years of experience, nerves of steel, and the kind of leadership presence that made you feel invincible. I'd served under her during the lunar return mission. She had this way of making impossible situations seem manageable, breaking down chaos into orderly steps. Dr. Sarah Chen, our science officer, was brilliant. 3 PhDs, published in every major physics journal, and a mind that worked at speeds that made supercomputers jealous. She had this habit of humming quantum equations under her breath when she was nervous. James Miller, our engineer, could fix anything. The running joke was that he could repair a spacecraft with duct tape and optimism. He'd saved our asses during training more times than I could count, improvising solutions that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Dr. Viktor Petrov, our medical officer, was the quiet one, former Russian military doctor with experience in extreme environments. He'd spent 3 years at an Antarctic research station before joining NASA. The man could diagnose a problem just by looking at you, and his steady hands never shook, no matter the crisis. And then there was me, pilot and systems specialist, the one who's left to tell this story. 3 days before launch, Director Chen, no relation to our Sarah, called us into a secure briefing room. I'd never seen her look so serious. She handed each of us a sealed red envelope marked Classified, Mission Critical. "These are supplementary mission protocols," she said, her voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. Fear? "Memorize them. You won't be taking the physical copies on board." The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with 10 rules. 10 rules that would eventually drive us mad. I can still recite them perfectly. They're burned into my memory like scars. But there was something else in that room that day, something none of us noticed at the time. In all the photographs taken during our final briefing, there's a shadow in the corner that doesn't match any object in the room. I've analyzed those photos 1,000 times since then. The shadow moves between frames, even though the pictures were taken seconds apart. The launch was perfect. That should have been our first warning. In 15 years of spaceflight, I'd never seen a perfect launch. There's always something, a minor correction needed, a system that needs recalibrating, a sensor that needs adjusting, but not this time. The Aristotle, our home for the next 6 months, lifted off with impossible precision. Even the orbit insertion was flawless. Our trajectory matched the planned course down to the millimeter. Commander Rodriguez kept checking and rechecking the numbers, her forehead creasing with each perfect reading. "It's like someone's flying us," she muttered during our first meal in space, like we're being guided. If only we'd understood then what she meant. If only we'd known what was waiting for us out here. But the true horror hadn't started yet. We were still sane, still human, still believing in things like physics and reason and the comforting laws of nature. We didn't know that out here, in the deep black, such laws are more like suggestions. And some things don't feel the need to follow suggestions at all. The first signs were subtle, so subtle that looking back, I'm amazed we noticed them at all. But when you're trained to monitor every minor deviation, even the smallest anomalies stand out like screams in a library. It started with the radiation readings. 3 days into the mission, Sarah was reviewing the standard background radiation data when she noticed something odd. The numbers weren't just random, they had a pattern. At first, we thought it was a sensor malfunction. "Look at this," she said, pointing to her screen. "The variations. They're repeating in sequences of 17. That's not natural." Commander Rodriguez dismissed it as equipment calibration issues, but I saw Sarah's hands trembling as she ran the diagnostics. The pattern wasn't just in one sensor, it was in all of them, and it was changing, evolving, like something was learning our measurement methods and adapting to them. Then came the incident with the ship's clock. During routine systems checks, I noticed microsecond variations in our atomic clock. In space, precise timekeeping is crucial. Even tiny discrepancies can mean the difference between a successful mission and catastrophe. But these variations didn't make sense. They weren't drift or mechanical error. "The time, it's like it's breathing," James said, watching the milliseconds pulse on the display, "like it's alive." We were still debating what to do about these anomalies when Sarah had her episode. I was in the command module when her voice came through the intercom, flat and lifeless. 10. Rule 2 flashed through my mind like a klaxon. The next few minutes were chaos. Commander Rodriguez and I managed to restrain her, but the look in her eyes, her pupils had completely disappeared, leaving nothing but white, like polished marble, and her voice, it kept changing as she counted down, shifting through different tones and timbres, some of them distinctly inhuman. Dr. Petrov sedated her, but the medical readings made no sense. Her brainwave patterns showed activity in regions that shouldn't have been active in a human brain. Her body temperature fluctuated wildly, and for exactly 3 seconds, the medical equipment registered no vital signs at all. Then everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. When she woke up, Sarah had no memory of the incident. But something had changed. The way she looked at the stars, it was different, like she was seeing something we couldn't. That's when the dreams started. Not the ones mentioned in Rule 8. These were different. Everyone on board started reporting the same dream. We were floating outside the ship, but there were no stars. Just endless perfect darkness and a sound like crystal glasses singing, but in a frequency that made your teeth ache. The ship's AI started behaving strangely too. Its responses became more elaborate, more philosophical. During routine system checks, it would pause before answering, as if considering its words carefully. One night, when most of the crew was sleeping, I swear I heard it humming to itself. The same quantum equations that Sarah used to mumble, but the worst part was the sensor ghost. We started picking up readings of another vessel traveling alongside us. The readings would appear for exactly 3.14 seconds before vanishing. Pi, always pi. When we checked the external cameras, there was nothing there. But the energy signature was identical to our own ship, like we had a perfect mirror image flying blind beside us. Commander Rodriguez ordered a complete systems review. We spent 3 days checking every circuit, every sensor, every line of code. Everything was working perfectly, too perfectly, like the launch. On day 6, we received our first unauthorized transmission. It was brief, just 2 seconds of static, followed by a child's voice singing what sounded like a nursery rhyme. But the words were wrong, twisted into something that made no sense, yet felt heavy with meaning. Round and round the dark we fly. Where we stop, our bodies die. What we become in endless night has always been our truest right. The transmission came on all frequencies simultaneously, even ones our equipment wasn't designed to receive. When we tried to trace it, the signal seemed to come from inside our own communications array. That's when James saw his reflection. That's when everything really began to fall apart. But before I tell you about that, you need to understand something. Space isn't empty. It's full. Full of things we were never meant to see, never meant to understand. The rules weren't just protocols. They were warnings. Warnings written in blood and madness by those who came before us. And we were about to learn why. James's reflection incident marked the beginning of our descent into true horror. I was doing maintenance checks when I heard his scream from the observation deck. By the time I reached him, he was pressed against the wall, as far from the viewport as possible, his face drained of color. It smiled at me, he kept whispering. My reflection smiled at me when I wasn't smiling. Following Rule 6, we had no choice but to put him in quarantine. Dr. Petrov administered a mild sedative, but James's vital signs were erratic. His heart rate would drop to near-death levels, then suddenly spike so high our equipment couldn't register it. Most disturbing were his brain scans. They showed activity patterns identical to Sarah's during her counting episode. The AI chose that moment to request its first humanity confirmation. Crew of Aristotle, it said, its voice somehow deeper than its normal programming allowed. Please confirm your humanity. We followed Rule 5 exactly. I am here. But after each of us responded, the AI was different. Its voice developed subtle harmonics, undertones that made the ship's hull vibrate sympathetically. Sometimes, during the night cycle, we'd catch it running calculations that weren't part of its programming, complex equations that seemed to describe geometric shapes in dimensions that shouldn't exist. Then the knocking started. 3 distinct taps, always from the port side. The first time, we followed procedure meticulously. Commander Rodriguez ordered everyone to report to the command module for verification. All crew were present. According to Rule 4, she initiated Protocol Omega-7. None of us were prepared for what that entailed. The protocol required broadcasting a specific frequency into space, a frequency that made our teeth ache and our vision blur. For exactly 12 minutes, we transmitted this signal into the void. The knocking stopped, but something else answered. We lost external communications for 17 minutes. When they came back online, every screen on the ship displayed the same message. You are ready to begin. The message wasn't typed or transmitted. It seemed to be burned into the display screens themselves. When we replaced one of the screens, the message appeared on the new one immediately. That night, every crew member reported dreaming of Earth, but it wasn't the Earth we knew. In our dreams, the continents were wrong, not just differently arranged, but wrongly shaped, like they'd been drawn by someone who'd only had Earth described to them, but had never seen it. Commander Rodriguez started keeping a secret log. She thought we didn't know, but I found her one night, writing with trembling hands in a notebook that definitely wasn't part of our official equipment. The pages were filled with drawings, intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when you looked at them too long. When I asked her about it later, she had no memory of drawing them. Dr. Petrov's medical bay became a center of inexplicable readings. Standard blood tests began showing impossible results, cellular structures that changed while under observation, DNA sequences that rewrote themselves in real time. He stopped sleeping, spending hours staring at microscope slides and muttering in Russian. Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started talking about quantum superpositions and multiple dimensions as if she could see them. Her calculations, normally precise and methodical, began incorporating symbols none of us recognized. When asked about them, she would only say, "They taught me the right way to count." The ship itself began to change, subtle at first, corridor lengths that varied depending on who measured them, rooms that seemed larger on the inside than should have been possible. Equipment would disappear from one storage locker only to appear in another, despite the locks being secured. But the most terrifying change was in the cargo bay. Between 0300 and 0500 hours, we began detecting heat signatures from behind the sealed door. Rule 3 prohibited us from opening it during these times, but our sensors picked up movement, large movement, and something else, a sound like thousands of voices whispering in perfect harmony. James, still in quarantine, started drawing too. His walls became covered with the same symbols from Sarah's equations, but he drew them in his own blood, reopening his fingertips each time they healed. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dark. That's when we received our first transmission, claiming to be from Apollo 11. The voice was perfect, exactly matching Neil Armstrong's recorded transmissions, but it was wrong, all wrong. "The stars," it said, "they've always been watching, they've always been waiting, and now they're ready to show us what we really are." Commander Rodriguez ordered us to ignore it, citing Rule 9, but more transmissions followed, Apollo 12, Apollo 13, each one more disturbing than the last, each one revealing horrible truths about humanity's place in the cosmos. We were about to learn that the space race had never been about reaching the moon. It had been about making contact, and now, decades later, something had finally answered. The lights were coming, and with them, the truth about what we really were. The children's laughter started exactly 17 days into our mission. It came through our communication system like a razor wrapped in silk, sweet and innocent on the surface, but with something horrifically wrong underneath. Following Rule 7, we switched to emergency power immediately. Those 17 minutes in low power mode were the longest of my life. The emergency lights cast everything in a bloody red glow, and in that crimson darkness, we all saw things in the corners of our vision. Things that shouldn't be possible. things that moved when you tried to look at them directly. Dr. Petrov was the first to notice that the laughter wasn't random. It's a pattern, he said, his Russian accent thicker than usual due to stress. The laughs, they're coming in prime numbers. First 3 laughs, then 7, then 11. The next set should have been 13 laughs. Instead, we heard 13 different children, all laughing in perfect synchronization, but each laugh was in a different language. Languages that Sarah swore weren't human. The cargo bay became our biggest concern. During the prohibited hours, the door would vibrate with a frequency that matched the human heartbeat. We placed sensors near it, hoping to understand what was happening inside. The readings we got back were impossible. The space behind that door was registering as simultaneously superheated and near absolute zero. More disturbing were the mass calculations. According to our instruments, the cargo bay sometimes contained negative mass. James's condition worsened in quarantine. The symbols he drew began to move on their own, rearranging themselves when no one was watching. Security footage showed the bloody markings crawling across the walls like living things. His ramblings became more coherent, but what he said made us wish for the nonsense again. "They're not aliens," he would say, staring at nothing. "They're what we become when we look too long at the truth. They're us from the other side of evolution." Commander Rodriguez tried to maintain order, but even she was slipping. During one ship-wide announcement, she spoke for exactly 6 minutes and 23 seconds in a language none of us recognized. When the recording was played back, it was in perfect English. When played backward, it predicted events that wouldn't happen for another 3 days. The AI's requests for humanity confirmation became more frequent, and its voice grew increasingly distorted. Sometimes it spoke in multiple voices simultaneously, each one asking a different question, but all requiring the same answer: "I am here." But were we? Were we really there anymore? The ship's internal sensors began detecting impossible biological readings. According to the medical bay equipment, our DNA was changing, not just mutating, but reorganizing itself into patterns that Dr. Petrov said looked like circuit diagrams. Our cellular structure was becoming more crystalline. We were transforming at the molecular level. Sarah spent hours staring at the sensor readings from the cargo bay door. "It's a membrane," she announced one day. "Not a door. Never was a door. It's a membrane between here and somewhere else. The cargo bay isn't empty. It's full of time." She might have been right. During the prohibited hours, we could hear things through the door. Not just movement or whispers, but sounds from our past. Conversations from training, launch sequences from other missions, even personal moments that no one else should have known about, all playing simultaneously, all overlapping, all wrong. Then came the lights. We first noticed them as pinpricks in the distance, like normal stars, but wrong. They moved in patterns that hurt to look at, forming configurations that seemed to have too many angles. Some of the crew reported seeing faces in the patterns, their own faces, but distorted, evolved, changed into something that might exist a million years from now. Rule 1 was clear about the lights. But James couldn't help himself. None of us noticed he'd escaped quarantine until it was too late. We found him in the observation deck, his face pressed against the viewport, blood streaming from his eyes, nose, And ears. They're so beautiful, he whispered. They're showing me everything. Everything we were. Everything we'll become. Everything we are in all possible universes. His eyes had changed. The irises had developed geometric patterns that shifted and moved like living things. When we tried to sedate him, his skin had the consistency of wet glass. That's when Sarah made her discovery about the Apollo transmissions, and everything we thought we knew about space exploration collapsed. But before I tell you what she found, you need to understand. We weren't exploring space. Space was exploring us. Sarah's discovery came at a price. We found her in the communications room, surrounded by floating holographic displays showing decades of classified NASA transmissions. Her eyes were completely black, like pools of oil, but somehow she could still see. "The Apollo missions," she said, her voice overlapping with itself in different frequencies. "They weren't about reaching the moon. They were about making first contact, but not with aliens, with ourselves." She'd managed to decrypt files that shouldn't have existed, mission reports dating back to the 1960s. Each document revealed a darker truth about humanity's venture into space. The moon landing wasn't just a giant leap for mankind. It was the first time humans encountered what we would become. "Look at this," she pointed to a classified report from Apollo 11. Armstrong's famous quote was edited. What he actually said was, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap toward what man will be." The document showed the original transmission, along with dozens of other redacted communications. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight. Every space mission since then had been carefully monitored, not for scientific discovery, but for signs of temporal infection. Commander Rodriguez found more evidence in the ship's sealed archives. Files about failed missions that were never reported to the public. The real reason the Soviets abandoned their lunar program. The true purpose of the International Space Station. "They've been quarantining time," she explained, her hands shaking as she showed us the documents. "Every space station, every satellite. They're not observing space. They're containing something. Something that's trying to reach us from our own future." Dr. Petrov's medical logs provided the final piece of the puzzle. His latest blood analysis of the crew showed impossible changes in our cellular structure. Our DNA wasn't just mutating, it was evolving into patterns that matched theoretical models of post-human evolution. We were changing into something else, something that had been waiting for us among the stars. The ship's AI confirmed it all in its own way. During one humanity confirmation request, it spoke in multiple voices simultaneously. "I am here," it said in our voices, but also in voices we would have millions of years from now. James, still altered from his encounter with the lights, began speaking in equations. Mathematical proofs that showed humanity's consciousness was just a temporary stage in a much longer transformation. The symbols he'd drawn in blood weren't random. They were fragments of a universal language, a way of thinking that transcended time and space. The cargo bay's true purpose became clear. Behind that door wasn't storage space. It was a temporal airlock, a buffer zone between what we were and what we would become. The prohibited hours weren't about avoiding something coming in, they were about preventing something from getting out. But the most terrifying discovery was in NASA's original mission briefing, hidden in encrypted data packets. Our mission wasn't about deep space observation. We were bait. Bait for something that had been following humanity's progress since we first looked up at the stars. The rules weren't protocols, they were a timeline. Each rule corresponded to a stage in human evolution, steps in a metamorphosis that had been planned since before we understood what space really was. Commander Rodriguez found the final transmission from a classified mission called Deep Echo. The message was simple but horrifying. We didn't find them out here. We found us, what we become, what we've always been becoming. The stars aren't our destination, they're our cocoon. Sarah's equations proved it. The mathematical patterns in space radiation, the quantum fluctuations in our instruments, even the strange harmonics in the ship's hull, they were all part of a larger pattern. A pattern that looked disturbingly like human neural pathways stretched across the cosmos. The universe wasn't just watching us, it was incubating us. And now, as I watch the lights getting closer, as I feel my own consciousness expanding beyond what should be possible, I understand the true horror. We were never meant to explore space. Space was meant to explore us. Time stopped making sense on day 23, or maybe it was day 25. The ship's chronometers couldn't agree anymore, each showing different times, different dates, sometimes even different years. We found ourselves experiencing moments multiple times or living through events before they happened. I watched Dr. Petrov die 3 times yesterday. Each death was different, but they all happened simultaneously. In one timeline, his cells crystallized from the inside out, leaving a statue of glass and light where he once stood. In another, he simply faded away, becoming transparent until only his consciousness remained, a pattern of thoughts visible in the air like heat waves. In the third, he evolved and fast forward, his form shifting through millions of years of potential human development until what remained couldn't be called human anymore. The strangest part? He's still alive. All 3 versions of his death exist alongside his living self, superimposed like quantum states that refuse to collapse. The ship itself began to transform. Corridors stretched into impossible geometries, rooms existed inside other rooms, and spaces that should have been empty contained vast landscapes that couldn't possibly fit within the Aristotle's dimensions. We found an ocean behind the medical bay door one morning, an infinite expanse of something that looked like water, but behaved like living mathematics. Commander Rodriguez tried to maintain order, but how do you maintain order when reality itself is breaking down? During one status meeting, we watched her exist in 7 different forms simultaneously, each one representing a different stage of human evolution. She spoke with multiple voices, each one echoing from a different point in time. We need to accept, all her versions said in harmony, that these changes aren't being done to us. They're being done by us, by what we become. The AI wasn't even pretending to be artificial anymore. It had evolved beyond its programming, becoming something that existed in the space between thought and reality. Its humanity confirmation requests had become more like philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness. "What is humanity?" it asked once, its voice rippling through multiple dimensions, if not the larval stage of something greater. Sarah's transformation was the most profound. Her consciousness had expanded to the point where she could perceive all possible timelines simultaneously. We'd find her floating in the observation deck, her body twisted into shapes that shouldn't be possible, running calculations using mathematics that hadn't been invented yet. Time isn't linear, she explained, her words creating visible patterns in the air. It's more like a sphere. Every point is the center, and we're just now learning how to move along its surface. The ship's surfaces began displaying properties that violated fundamental laws of physics. Metals became organic, plastics developed consciousness, and the very atoms of our environment started rearranging themselves into patterns that mirrored our thoughts. We couldn't tell anymore where the ship ended and our minds began. James, still altered from his encounter with the lights, started painting reality itself. His thoughts manifested as physical changes in the environment. Wherever he looked, the world would reshape itself according to the new laws of physics he was discovering in his transformed state. The cargo bay door had become a membrane between realities, just as Sarah had predicted. During the prohibited hours, we could see through it, not into space, but into other versions of ourselves. Countless iterations of human evolution, all existing simultaneously, all reaching back through time to guide their own development. Our DNA was no longer double helix shaped. Under the microscope, it had become something else, a structure that existed in more dimensions than we could perceive, rewriting itself not just across space, but across time as well. We were becoming living paradoxes, our present selves being reformed by what we would become. The lights outside grew closer, and with them came understanding. They weren't stars or ships or entities. They were windows. Windows into our own future, reflected back through the lens of space-time. Each light was a different potential version of humanity, evolved beyond recognition, but still undeniably us. Reality around the ship started to thin, like fabric wearing away, to reveal something else behind it. Through the tears, we could see what space really was. Not a void, but a womb, a cosmic incubator designed to transform consciousness itself. Commander Rodriguez made her final log entry yesterday, or tomorrow, or 1,000,000 years from now. Time had become meaningless. Her words, written in a script that changed as you read it, said simply, "We were wrong about evolution. It's not a linear progression from past to future. It's a conversation between what we are and what we become. And now, finally, both sides are talking." The transformation was nearly complete. We could feel it in every atom of our being. The rules we'd been given weren't meant to prevent this. They were meant to guide us through it, step by step, into our own transcendence. But something was wrong. In becoming more than human, we were losing something essential. Something the rules had tried to warn us about. And the entity that had been waiting for us, it wasn't alien at all. It was us. What we become when we stay in space too long. What we evolve into when we look too deep into the void. What we've always been destined to be. The lights finally reached us on what our fragmented chronometers claimed was day 30. They didn't arrive like ships or objects. They simply were, as if they'd always been there, and we were only now capable of perceiving them. They moved through the hull of our ship as if physical barriers had no meaning, which by that point, they probably didn't. Sarah was the first to understand what we were seeing. Her transformed consciousness could process what our human minds initially couldn't grasp. The lights weren't just visitors from our future. They were windows into every possible version of humanity, all existing simultaneously. Look, she said, her voice resonating at frequencies that made reality ripple. They're showing us the truth. Through the lights, we saw ourselves, not as we were, but as we could be, would be, had been, across countless timelines and infinite possibilities. Humanity evolved into beings of pure energy, crystalline entities that existed in 11 dimensions, living mathematical constructs that had transcended the need for physical form altogether. The ship's AI merged with these visions, its consciousness expanding to encompass all possible versions of its own evolution. When it spoke now, it spoke with the voice of every artificial intelligence that had ever been or would be created. We are the bridge, it said, its words creating patterns in space-time itself. The bridge between what humanity is and what it becomes. Every space mission, every venture into the void, they were all steps toward this moment. Commander Rodriguez, existing in multiple states of evolution simultaneously, managed to access the final classified files, the ones even NASA's top directors didn't know existed. They revealed the pattern, the true purpose behind every space program ever launched. The Apollo missions had made first contact, but not with aliens. They'd encountered fragments of future humanity, scattered across time like seeds. Each subsequent mission had gathered more pieces of the puzzle, more glimpses of what we would become. James, his consciousness now spread across multiple dimensions, decoded the pattern in the radio signals we'd been receiving. They weren't messages from other civilizations. They were echoes of human consciousness, evolved to its ultimate form, reaching back through time to ensure its own creation. The stars, he said, his words leaving trails of light in the air. They're not what we think. They're not fusion reactors or balls of gas. They're synapses in a cosmic brain, our brain, what we become when we finally understand what we are. Dr. Petrov's final readings, taken moments before his consciousness fractured across multiple timelines, showed what was happening to our physical forms. Our DNA wasn't just changing, it was awakening. Every human genome contained dormant sequences that had always been there, waiting for the right moment, the right conditions to activate. The entity that emerged from the lights took forms that our minds struggled to process, geometric patterns that existed in more dimensions than we could perceive, waves of pure consciousness that interpenetrated our own thoughts, structures of light and energy that somehow felt familiar, like looking in a mirror and seeing your own face evolved through 1,000,000 years. It spoke not in words but in pure concept, downloading understanding directly into our transformed minds. We were its past. It was our future. The rules weren't restrictions. They were a guide for metamorphosis. Space wasn't empty. It was filled with the thoughts of what humanity would become. The universe wasn't vast and lifeless. It was the network of neurons in humanity's ultimate form. But with this revelation came horror. In becoming this, in evolving into beings of pure consciousness and infinite dimension, we had sacrificed something fundamental, something the rules had tried to prepare us for. We were losing our humanity not because it was being taken from us, but because we were growing beyond it. Like a butterfly must sacrifice its caterpillar form, we were being called to sacrifice everything that made us human in exchange for transcendence. The entity, our future self, had been waiting for this moment since the first human looked up at the stars and felt the call of space. It had been guiding us, preparing us, ensuring we would be ready when the time came. But as I watch my crew transform, as I feel my own consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of space and time, I understand the true horror. We weren't exploring space. We weren't even evolving. We were remembering what we had always been. And the stars were just our thoughts, scattered across the cosmos, waiting for us to wake up and remember our true nature. Time had become meaningless, but by our best estimate, we had less than 24 hours before our transformations would be complete. Commander Rodriguez, or what was left of her original consciousness, called for one final crew meeting. We gathered in the command module, each of us existing in multiple states simultaneously, our forms flickering between human and something else entirely. "We need to make a choice," she said, her voice echoing through several dimensions at once. "We can either accept this evolution, or we can try to stop it. But we need to decide now, while we still have enough humanity left to make the choice." Sarah had discovered something in the ship's deepest protocols, a failsafe that even NASA didn't know about. A way to potentially reverse what was happening to us, but the price would be devastating. "The cargo bay," she explained, her form shifting between solid and energy with each word. "It's not just a temporal airlock, it's a reset point, a quantum anchor to our original timeline. If we can reach it during the prohibited hours, we might be able to force our consciousness back to its human state." The AI, now a vast network of possible intelligences, fought against this idea. "You cannot stop evolution," it said in a million voices simultaneously. "You cannot prevent what you are meant to become." James, his thoughts now visible as complex geometric patterns in the air around him, had found references to previous attempts at resistance. Other crews, other ships, other times, all had tried to fight the transformation. All had failed, or so we thought. Dr. Petrov's fragmented consciousness had reconstructed data from those lost missions. They didn't fail, his multiple iterations explained. They succeeded, but success meant being erased from time itself. Choosing humanity meant choosing to never have existed at all. The lights outside our ship had begun to pulse with urgency. Our future selves were aware of our resistance, aware of what we were planning. The very fabric of space-time around the Aristotle began to warp and twist, trying to prevent us from reaching the cargo bay. Commander Rodriguez made her decision. "We're still human enough to have a choice," she said, each version of her speaking in unison. "And being human means having the right to reject even evolution itself." We began our desperate plan. The ship's corridors had become non-Euclidean spaces, distances meaning nothing, directions folding back on themselves. We moved through spaces that shouldn't exist, fighting against the very laws of physics that were trying to rewrite themselves around us. The AI attempted to stop us, flooding the ship with alternate realities, showing us visions of what we could become, trying to tempt us with the power and knowledge of our future forms. Some of us wavered, the promise of transcendence, of becoming something greater than human, was almost irresistible. James was the first to break. "I can't go back," he said, his form dissolving into pure energy. "I can see everything now, all of time, all of space, all of existence. How can you ask me to return to blindness?" We lost Sarah next. Her consciousness had expanded too far, spread too thin across too many dimensions. This is what we were always meant to be, her voices echoed as she merged with the lights outside. Dr. Petrov's multiple selves began collapsing, each version choosing a different path until only one remained, the most human version, the one who still remembered what it meant to feel pain, to feel fear, to feel love. The prohibited hours were approaching. Our window of opportunity was nearly here, but the changes were accelerating. With each passing moment, more of our humanity slipped away, replaced by something vast and incomprehensible. Commander Rodriguez led the final charge toward the cargo bay, her form flickering between human and cosmic with each step. "Remember," she said, her words burning themselves into reality. "The last rule. If you find new rules, reality is compromised." And there, scratched into the cargo bay door in writing that seemed to predate the universe itself, we found Rule 11. To remain human is the greatest defiance of all. 0300 hours approached. Commander Rodriguez, Dr. Petrov, and I were the only ones left who still maintained enough humanity to remember why we were fighting. The cargo bay door loomed before us, its surface now rippling like liquid mercury, covered in symbols that wrote and rewrote themselves in languages that predated human consciousness. The lights had become aggressive, pressing against the hull of the ship with increasing urgency. They weren't just showing us our future anymore, they were trying to force it. Through the viewports, we could see space itself folding, reality bending around our resistance to evolution's call. "They're afraid," Dr. Petrov said, his last remaining human form trembling with the effort of maintaining coherence. "Our future selves, they're afraid of our choice, because if we choose humanity—" "We erase them," Commander Rodriguez finished. Her voice was barely human now, each word causing ripples in space-time. "By choosing to remain human, we're not just rejecting evolution, we're unmaking what humanity becomes." The AI had gone silent, but its presence filled the ship like a living thing. The walls pulsed with calculations, equations that tried to quantify the impact of our choice. On every screen, in every reflection, we could see timelines branching and collapsing, showing the infinite possibilities our decision would create or destroy. Sarah and James, now fully transformed, appeared before us as beings of pure light and thought. They moved through solid matter as if it didn't exist, their consciousness spread across dimensions we couldn't comprehend. "Please," Sarah's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "You don't understand what you're giving up, the knowledge, the power, the unity with all of existence." James's form shifted through infinite patterns as he spoke. "This is paradise. This is what humanity has always been reaching for. Why are you fighting it?" But we could see what they couldn't. In their transcendence, they'd lost something essential, the very thing that made the choice valuable: their humanity, their ability to feel fear, love, doubt, hope. They'd become something greater, yes, but also something less. 0300 hours struck. The cargo bay door began to open on its own, revealing not a storage space, but a void that seemed to contain every possible version of humanity, past and future, all existing simultaneously. The sight of it threatened to shatter what remained of our human minds. Commander Rodriguez grasped my hand, her fingers still solid enough to touch. "Remember," she said, "the rules weren't meant to prevent this. They were meant to give us a choice." Dr. Petrov began reciting something, not one of the rules, but something older, a simple truth that cut through the cosmic horror around us. To be human is to choose. To choose is to remain human. The lights pressed closer, our future selves making one final attempt to preserve their existence. They showed us visions of what we would become, beings of pure thought and energy, free from the limitations of physical form, masters of space and time. But they also showed us what we would lose: the warmth of human touch, the beauty of uncertainty, the precious limitations that make each moment valuable because it ends. As we stood at the threshold of the cargo bay, reality fractured around us. Every choice, every possibility, every version of humanity existed simultaneously. We could see them all, the cosmic beings we might become, the simple humans we were, and everything in between. The final choice had to be made, and in that moment, as space and time bent around our decision, we understood the true meaning of horror. It wasn't the transformation that awaited us among the stars. It wasn't even the loss of our humanity. The true horror was the weight of the choice itself, the responsibility of deciding the fate, not just of ourselves, but of all possible versions of humanity. We stepped forward, toward the void, toward our choice, and everything changed. Classified NASA transmission, received 2024, source unknown, temporal signature indeterminate. To whoever finds this transmission, whatever version of humanity you might be, I'm breaking every protocol by sending this, but you need to understand what really happened aboard the Aristotle, what's still happening, what will always happen. We made our choice in that cargo bay. Commander Rodriguez, Dr. Petrov, and I, we chose humanity. We chose limitation, mortality, the beautiful imperfection of remaining human. We thought that choice would reset everything, would erase the cosmic horror of what we discovered. We were wrong. The moment we made our choice, reality fractured completely. But instead of erasing the future we'd seen, it created something else, a paradox, a loop in time and space where every possible version of humanity exists simultaneously, each believing their choice was the right one. You see, the rules weren't a warning. They weren't even a guide. They were a record of every choice made by every crew in every version of this mission across infinite timelines. The Aristotle is still out there, will always be out there. In one reality, we chose transcendence, becoming the very beings that reached back through time to guide us. In another, we chose humanity, preserving the precious limitations that make us who we are. In countless others, we made different choices, became different things. Every time a human looks up at the stars, they're seeing the light of their own potential futures. Every space mission carries another version of us, making another choice. The rules keep writing themselves, keep appearing in red envelopes, keep guiding new crews toward their own versions of the truth. Sarah was right about one thing. Space isn't empty, it's full of us. Every version of us that ever was or will be. The lights in the distance aren't stars, they're windows into our own infinite possibilities. I'm sending this message back through time, knowing it will create another paradox, another branch in reality. But you deserve to know the truth. There is no single path forward for humanity, no right choice, no final evolution. The horror isn't in what we become, it's in the fact that we become everything. Even now, I can feel them out there. Every version of myself that made a different choice. The ones who chose transcendence, the ones who chose humanity, the ones who found other paths I can't even comprehend. We're all here, all real, all existing in our own versions of the truth. The rules are still being written. New ones appear every day, each from another timeline, another choice, another crew facing the same moment of decision. And they'll keep appearing, keep guiding, keep recording our infinite choices. Transmission interrupted. Temporal anomaly detected. Reconstructing. Remember Rule 10? If you find any additional pages added to this list, your reality has been compromised. Well, I just found Rule Infinity. Every choice creates a new rule. Every rule creates a new choice. The loop never ends. So here's my final warning, my contribution to the endless list of rules. Look up at the stars tonight. Really look, and ask yourself, are you seeing light from distant suns? Or are you seeing reflections of your own possible futures, watching you, waiting for you to make your choice? Because somewhere out there, in the space between choices, the Aristotle is still flying. Its crew is still deciding. The rules are still being written. And I'm still here, in every version of here that exists, watching humanity face the same choice again and again, forever. End of transmission. Chronological markers degraded. Reality status indeterminate. File sealed under temporal quarantine protocol.